Ukraine, and if Putin had not invaded Ukraine, Hamas would not have invaded Israel.
Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Henri Levy. When Hamas shocked the world with the October 7th massacre, Israel felt embraced as never before. World leaders flew in to bear witness and express solidarity. Parliament buildings lit up in the colors of the Israeli flag. And Israelis thought, that's it, this time in our darkest hour, the world gets it. They will back us as we fight for humanity, against Hamas, and to bring the hostages home. That optimism has long since given way to a sense of betrayal. The knowledge that the world wants to end this war with Hamas on its feet, consistently undermining Israel's remaining leverage to get the hostages back. Only a handful of countries voting with Israel at the UN, nobody standing with Israel at the ICJ, countries backing the International Criminal Court after the outrageous request for arrest warrants, and now Spain, Ireland, and Norway recognizing a made-up Palestinian state, which only tells Palestinians that terrorism works and directly encourages the next October 7th massacre. Israelis have never felt so alone. Solitude is Israel's condition, but must it be its fate? Bernard-Henri Lévy, or BHL, is a French philosopher, journalist, filmmaker, and public intellectual. He's a leading member of the Nouveaux Philosophes movement, but he's not up there in an ivory tower, he's traveling to war zones to bear witness and write history. His latest book, Solitude of Israel, out in French, set for release in English later this year. And in it he reflects on thoughts that have been troubling him since October 7th. He visited Israel to tell his fellow Jews, "You are not alone," speaking at the hostages rally with words of inspiration. Survival is the humblest form of existence, and the hostages' families are honoring the survival and endurance of the hostages. Our conversation moves beyond the shallow, shifting sands of daily news update to the realms of ideas, calling on us to look at this seminal moment in Jewish history through the lens of history and thought. Asking what it means for the future of democracy, what it means for the future of freedom, what it means for the history of the Jews. Because these might sound like separate questions, but they are so deeply intertwined. Welcome, bienvenue, to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Bonjour, Monsieur Lévy. Bienvenue à State of a Nation. Je suis très heureux de vous accueillir.
Merci.
And for the benefit of our listeners who don't speak French, we'll continue the conversation from now on in English. Mr. Lévy, welcome very much to State of a Nation. It's good to have you here.
Thank you.
This is, I believe, your second time back in Israel since the October 7th attacks. You were right here on the ground on October 8th. I'm wondering, what brings you back this time, and what do you notice has changed in the country?
What brings me back? Same. Solidarity, brotherhood. There is, among all of us, Jews in diaspora, Jews in Israel, such a feeling of distress, of fatigue, of sometimes depression, discouragement. So I want to be there. If I can bring, I don't know, something in the conversation, some kind of a support, moral support, I'm happy to do it. And how did I find the country this time? Brave, strong, a country of lions. I heard that yesterday, which is true. And at the same time, of course, a sadness. This war is long. It is the longest war which Israel had to wage since the War of Independence. The only one which was longer was the War of Independence. It's long for such a little country, great by spirit and little by size.
That feeling of distress that you talk about within the Jewish world, I think speaks directly to the title of the new book that you've written, so fresh that it isn't out in English yet, The Solitude of Israel. We have a copy of it here, still in French, Solitude d'Israel. What is it about?
It is about the heart of Israel. It's about the heart, the soul of Israel. You know, any Jewish writer has a secret rendezvous with Israel. Leo Strauss had a rendezvous with Israel, with a book about Israel. Joseph Kessel had a rendezvous with a book with Raymond Aron, the great liberal French thinker, had a rendezvous with Israel. And generally what you need for the rendezvous to be fulfilled, to be met, is an event. For Raymond Aron, for example, it was the war of 67 and the statement of General de Gaulle, so rude to the Jewish people. You know, you remember that. And Raymond Aron, it created the start, and he wrote in sorrow and in rage his book. Me, for this rendezvous to be accomplished, what was probably needed, alas, was this unique, unprecedented event, which is October 7. This is the very moment where this book starts. It is not about October 7. It starts with it. It is about the deleting, the erasing of October 7 in the Western world. It is about the loneliness of Israel. It is about the unfairness in which Israel is treated by the concert of nations. It is about all of that. And it is about the core values of Israel, which I think are still not only alive here, but vibrant. This is one of the theses of my book. I hear so many people say that they don't recognize Israel, that Israel is losing his soul and so on. I don't believe so. I don't believe so. I think that the spirit, the genius of Israel is still vibrant here in the army, in the universities, on Hostage Square every Saturday night, and so on.
October 7th was a singular event that I think for Jews around the world did two things. On the one hand, it reinforced a lot of their convictions and faith, but it also made a lot of people rethink things and reconsider new ideas and come to new realizations about the world. And so I'm wondering, in this book, are you making a case about things you were saying before that you think now have validation, or has October 7th made you look differently at Israel, at the Jewish world, at the wider Western world, and maybe realize things about it that you hadn't before? How has October 7th changed your thinking?
Two things for me. In my own life, two things were changed. Number one, I'm more aware than ever of the vulnerability of Israel. I have always thought that the Jewish people and that Israel are vulnerable. Strong, of course, strong because of the army, strong by spirit, strong by study, but also vulnerable. You cannot live surrounded by enemies with billions of people who want your annihilation without being vulnerable. This sense of vulnerability was, of course, made more accurate by the invasion of October 7, because October 7 was a pogrom and an invasion. The country was invaded by terrorists, but also an army. Hamas, we are right to call them terrorists, of course, but it was an army of terrorists, and the plan was to invade Israel, and what happened was a proper invasion. So this changed for me, and this feeling, this fragility of Israel appeared for all of us, you know. And number two, the rest of the world. I always thought that, for example, the alliance with America was not granted, it has not always been so solid, by the way. The alliance with America is systematic, the veto of America at the Security Council, since a quarter of a century, not more. in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s of the last century, America voted many times against Israel, okay? I always believed that this support was sort of fragile. We see it now. We see that the countries who are supposed to be brotherly, sister nations, and so on, are wavering, and France also.
But I'm wondering on a deeper level, it's not just the question of geopolitics and analyzing the alliance between Israel and the US. A lot of Jews felt after October 7th not only isolated and lonely, but also intensely betrayed by the world. They looked around and they saw that the enlightened world was actually darker than they thought it was. So I'm wondering whether that slap in the face of October 7th, how has that changed how you see Western society and understand the zeitgeist within France and more broadly?
You said the word, betrayal, of course. You know, when America intervened in Afghanistan in order to destroy Al-Qaeda after September 11, the whole free world was supporting America, okay? When France participated in the Battle of Mosul in order to break the apparatus of ISIS who did Bataclan, Charlie Hebdo, Hypercacher, and so on, there was a huge, broad alliance around France. Some Arab countries, some countries of Europe, big alliance, big solidarity. When Israel is facing the same sort of situation, which is to try to break the military core, political and military core of Hamas, same situation. Israel is alone. No alliance, no military alliance, no real political alliance, and a moral solitude, and some attacks everywhere, reprobation, an inversion of the charge of the proof, Israel on the bench of the accused.
Does that surprise you, or did you think that that was what was going to happen inevitably?
I was surprised. Honestly, I was surprised. Why? Because what happened October 7 was so black and white. There is no doubt. It was not, I said an invasion before, but it was also such an unprecedented crime. I never heard, for example, about rapes of women operated in this way, in this savage way. I don't want to describe here, but we all know. I never heard that. I never saw, except maybe in Nigeria 20 years ago, 15 years ago, such a kidnapping of so many people taken like cattle, like beasts, and transferred and probably for some of them killed immediately to hell. Normally, the whole world should have sympathized 100% with that.
Why
and
doesn't
sympathy happened for a few hours, maybe a few days, and no more.
Why do you think that is? You say on the one hand, you would have expected the world to side foursquare with Israel. On the other hand, you're surprised that they didn't. And I'm wondering, yes, the US went after Al-Qaeda. The French joined the rest of the world in going after ISIS. What is it about Israel that we have a sense here that somehow Israel is the only country that's not allowed to win a war? Some people would go even further and say the Jews are not allowed to fight back. Is that how you put your finger on the pulse?
Israel is the only democracy who, in the big battle against terrorism and forces of darkness, is not allowed, is asked to lead the battle alone first and not allowed to win. The last declaration yesterday of President Biden in this regard are hopeless, honestly. How can you...
Well, I'll just say for our listeners, we're recording this episode the morning after President Biden said in an interview with CNN that if Israel goes into the city of Rafah to pursue the last Hamas battalions, he will essentially cut off arms supplies to Israel.
When Iraq went in the city of Mosul, jewel of humanity, with a lot of civilian casualties, I was there. I was on the ground. I was on the battlefield. I was filming a documentary about the Battle of Mosul. It is available online. You can see it. No American president, no Western president asked Iraq to hold on, not to enter in the old city. It was a terrible battle. Nobody even thought to ask Iraq. It was Iraq who was the sword at that time, the vanguard of the coalition. Nobody thought to ask them to stop. Today, the Battle of Rafah, as terrible as it can be, entering in Rafah, of course it is war. But how can you have expelled terrorists, Hamas from Khan Younis, from Gaza City, and let them regroup in Rafah and stop the fight and let them appear on the ruins of the country and claim victory? This is what will happen. If the claim of Biden yesterday at CNN is the reality, we will see Hamas claiming victory.
To us, it's so obvious on a strategic level why Israel must go after Hamas and destroy it. But I want to understand from you, from a broader look at the longue durée of history, as you would say in French. Why does Israel stand alone? Why is Israel the only democracy that is not allowed to win wars? Why do we find ourselves in this repeated pattern of the Jews with their backs against the wall? Some people think it's a big aha moment to say, look how many countries have turned against you, but that seems to be the recurring pattern of history. Why? Why the solitude of Israel?
Because it is Israel. Alas, because it is a Jewish state, because it is a state of the Jews, and because all this has awakened very dark anti-Jewish feelings in the population of the world, in the apparatus of the United Nations bureaucracy. It has revived dark and terrible words. When you see...
It's as simple as that. Israel's solitude simply harkens back to traditional anti-Jewish prejudice?
It's not traditional in new way, of course, in new habits, but it has to do something with that. You know, when the UN, which is supposed to be defending international law, who blessed the creation of Israel, when the UN at the highest level accuses Israel of genocide, when at the highest level the UN does not want to see that Israel does what no democratic nation ever did to avoid as much as possible the civilian casualties, what is it, if not an anti-Israel and anti-Jewish bias?
I want to show here a copy of the cover of The Economist from a few weeks ago that sparked a lot of discussion in Israel. For those following us on YouTube can see front cover of The Economist showing an Israeli flag essentially being held up on a reed, propped up with a stick, blowing through a sandstorm. And the headline says, Israel alone. And for me, this immediately brought to mind the verse from Numbers that Israel is a nation that dwells alone, not to be reckoned among the nations. And I'm wondering, when you look at this, do you think this is Israel's fate to suffer eternal solitude? Is this the fate of the Jewish people, to always stand alone against the world? Why does it appear to be a law of history that Israel is alone? What can we do about it?
It is not our fate. The verse of the Numbers which you quote says something quite different. It means that Israel has a special destiny, that Israel has a mission, that when the Talmud says in the comment of that verse that even already Abraham stands on the side of a river with the other nations on the other side, it means that Israel is a special nation with a special vocation. It does not mean that Israel should be abandoned by the rest of the world. This is not a fate. And so, first thing. And number two, I would not have written my book before this cover. It is the same title, but it was a few weeks before. If I did not nourish, if I had not the hope to overcome this solitude. I'm not resigned to this solitude. I don't think it is fatal. I think that we may resist this solitude, reply to those who condemn Israel. It is still time for fight and time for hope. And this is what I do in Europe with my book, and what I will do in America very soon, because the book is going to be released in the States in a few weeks now. So no, it's time for fight and time for hope.
But the whole point of Zionism was supposed to be to enable the Jews to reclaim their place in the family of nations. Herzl's vision was the Jews are regarded as a stateless people. Give them a home, they will be normalized in the family of nations because Jews will be identified as having a mother country. And that hasn't worked. Herzl's vision that by having a state of their own, Jews would be normalized and enter the family of nations as a normal member, that vision has malfunctioned. Why?
First of all, the dream of Herzl was a little different, to be a nation as other nation, but also a special nation. The idea was not, Israel is the last comer in the concert of nations. A movement started with French Revolution, 1789.
Thank you for that.
Of nation buildings out of the empires, and one of the last is Israel. Okay, in 1947.
Is that fair to say, given that Israel was one of the original third members of the United Nations, and there were so many other decolonial movements that came after it? I mean, Israel is one of the older sovereign states in the world.
Of course. The reviving, the resurrection of Israel as a state nation in the modern sense of the term, could have happened at the end of 19th century. You had already Zionism, could have happened after the Balfour Declaration, and so on. It happened. It had to be, for this to happen, we did need an anti-imperialist fight against the British. The British opposed the birth of Israel. It happened late, okay? Not as late as the Ivory Coast, maybe, okay.
But certainly with regards to Europe.
More late to it than Italy, than the German unity, whatever. So the founders of Israel said, in a way, okay, we are late. Let's take advantage of this being late in order to avoid some of the mistakes which others did, and to make a good nation, a special nation, a nation patriotic, but not chauvinistic, for example. This was in the project of the founders of Israel. And this worked, in a way. This worked for a time. Israel played the game. Israel built a great state. Israel built out of overnight. This never happened anywhere, with people coming from everywhere in the world, coming from the Arab countries, coming from Europe, coming from Russia, coming from Latin America, black people, white people. Out of all of that, overnight, Israel built a vibrant democracy. It worked, and it still works till today. So what has to be done is to explain over and over, more and more, to those who are deaf and blind to this reality. This is an ideological battle which has to be waged and which can be won.
I want to look back to something you said earlier about how October 7th has seemed to have receded into a blip in the global consciousness. People are forgetting the magnitude of the horrors on October 7th. Because I just came back from a visit to Poland. I was there on the March of the Living, and I took part in a conference on a panel with a number of journalists about the war of the media in war. And the journalists there were talking about how Ukraine, which you've covered, and I want to discuss this with you, has receded out of European consciousness. It's becoming a forgotten war. And I'm wondering why you think that is, that in the last 2 years, the world has essentially forgotten about Ukraine. It's fallen off the front pages, but the Israel-Hamas war has not. What is it about the Israel's conflicts that mean they don't recede into becoming forgotten conflicts? Why do they have such a grip on the global imagination?
Because you have strong, vocal movements in our democracies, in our campuses, of young people screaming slogans which they borrow from Hamas. What do you want to? How do you want things to be? You have the flower of the American nation, the students, the best of the French universities, the youth, the future, who go in the streets and scream from Palestine, from a river to the sea, Palestine will be free, who scream, we want not one October 7, but 1, 2, 3, 10, 1,000 October.
I think it was 10,000 October 7.
10,000 October 7, yeah. And this was, by the way, a sort of obscene cartoon, obscene caricature, obscene imitation of an old slogan of the youth of the 60s who said, when there was a war in Vietnam, America bombing Vietnam, the left at that time said, we want to do 1, 2, 3 Vietnams. This is the origin of this quote. 1, 2, 3. This was Che Guevara. Che Guevara said that. 1, 2, 3, 1,000 Vietnam. So these students, which are illiterate, which are brainwashed by the useful idiots of Hamas, they cartoonize without even knowing it a noble slogan. In the 60s, it was a noble slogan, to speaking of the resistance of a people, etc. But they turn it into an anti-Semitic slogan, which is disgusting. But this prevents this oblivion, which you say. Israel is on front line because of that.
I wonder how you understand then what is happening on campuses around the world. By the way, are we seeing the same thing on French campuses that we're seeing in America with the tentifada they have there?
We are, as always, there is a little counter time. It comes with a little delay, but we have that also in Sciences Po, in La Sorbonne, in provinces of France. We have this same sort of movement. Yes.
Because this is a movement that is not only taking Hamas's side in this war, it's a movement that seems to romanticize the Palestinian cause, to romanticize Hamas and glorify violence. We've all seen the images of white Americans prostrating themselves on the ground and worshipping Allah on Western campuses in their crop tops and tank tops. And I'm wondering what it is you think that is so fundamentally broken within Western culture, within Western civilization, that young people reach university and reach out to a barbaric Islamic fundamentalist group as a source of meaning. Why do young people in the West need Hamas as a crutch for meaning?
They don't romanticize the Palestinian cause. Romanticism is a beautiful thing. They don't romanticize at all. They know exactly. You had some students, you had some professors at Cornell University, for example, who in the very October 8, October 9 maybe, before the Israeli retaliation, who screamed in videos who were seen millions of times that the October 7 was great, that October 7 was a joyful event, that it was well deserved. You had an intellectual, Judith Butler, who said that it was an act of resistance, that she might not agree with the full program but that it was a noble resistance. They don't romanticize. They know exactly the rapes. They know exactly the beheadings. They know exactly the butchery which happened on October 7. And they think it is well deserved for the Jews. not romanticizing. Romanticizing would be, I don't know, to give great intention to Hamas, to deny the crimes. This would be, no, they assume the crimes, they know that they are barbarian, and they approve that.
I want to get your pick on a fascinating quote that I came across this week from Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. Often much maligned by people who haven't actually read the book and think that he was prophesying that the world has reached a permanent state of liberal democracy. It's not what he says. He argues that liberal democracy of the 1990s is essentially the high point of Western civilization, of global development, but he spots ways that it can come undone. And I came across this fascinating paragraph, and I wonder how you think that it connects to what we're seeing within intellectual climates right now in the way that they are turning against Israel and turning on the West. He writes this: "But supposing that the world has become filled up, so to speak, with liberal democracies, such that there exists no tyranny and oppression worthy of the name against which to struggle. Experience suggests that if men cannot struggle on behalf of a just cause, because that just cause was victorious in an earlier generation, then they will struggle against the just cause. They will struggle for the sake of struggle. They will struggle, in other words, out of a certain boredom. For they cannot imagine a world without struggle. And if the greater part of the world in which they live is characterized by peaceful and prosperous liberal democracy, then they will struggle against that peace and prosperity and against democracy." End quote. And I'm wondering, do you agree with that prophetic analysis, that what you're seeing on Western campuses is a revolt against the West out of a certain boredom with the comfort that the West has provided them?
The West has always had this boredom about liberty. The battle for liberty, the cause of liberty, is not given forever. You have always had a fatigue of liberty in the West, always. And you have always had some intellectuals and some vivid forces fighting against freedom. Freedom is a burden. Freedom is difficult. Democracy is hard. Tyranny is much more easy. To accept to be treated as well-fed beasts can be a choice for humanity. It's more easygoing. So you had at the end of the 19th century, you had a huge crisis of liberal values in all Europe. At the time of the Dreyfus affair, for example, you had a huge movement, pre-fascist movement, where people said, we are fed up with liberty. We want populism. We want tyranny. In the 30s, what was the rise of fascism? It was fed up with liberty. It does not work. It's too difficult. Let's invent something else. And it came from Nazi in Germany to Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, a world wave of anti-liberalism. Today, we are living the same sort of phenomenon from Putin in Russia, the counter-revolution in Russia. Something happened after 1989 in Russia, but it was overwhelmed by the counter-revolution which Putin embodies. In Iran, in China, China is building a real pattern of society, strong, well-articulated, proponing a model, depriving the humanity from liberty. Radical Islam, and all of that all these ideas are penetrating the West and are fighting in the West against those who still believe in human rights, freedom, representative democracy, and so on, which are not at all the pre-given thing which some thought after the fall of the wall of Berlin.
It's a very disturbing analysis to say that throughout the West there's always been this trend of boredom with liberty, which is difficult. It certainly helps to explain the mass Islamic prayers among non-Muslims on Western campuses. Islam, of course, meaning submission. But when you place it in that context, Why do you think right now the West is going through one of those moments, like you identified in the late 19th century in France, like you identified before the rise of fascism? Why is the West having this moment of boredom with freedom, boredom with democracy, an attraction to tyranny? Fine, you say it's not romanticization because these people understand why Hamas is going after the Jews and they support it. But what has gone wrong? Why did the liberal democracy of the 1990s malfunction and bring us to this moment where so many people are glorifying barbaric political violence against Jews?
I don't know what we did wrong. We probably did something wrong, but I'm not so sure. You have strong guys and strong women who are opposing democracy, even in Europe. Look at in the European Union, Viktor Orban, for example, great country, Hungary, liberated from tyranny, liberated from the grips of Russia, rushing to go back into the grips. It's a very strange phenomenon. So this battle has always happened, and sometimes the Democrats, liberals, take the advantage, and sometimes they lose.
Which way are we going this time?
The real problem, now we are losing. We are losing because probably America, since 20 years, is in a moment when America does not play its role. What happened recently with Afghanistan was a huge mistake.
You mean the hasty departure?
Yes, the hasty, shameful departure. I'm sure that if the Trump-Biden program of leaving Afghanistan had not been fulfilled, Putin would not have invaded Ukraine, and if Putin had not invaded Ukraine, Hamas would not have invaded Israel. All that is a chain. When the bad guys feel that democracies are weak, that democracy don't react, that democracy don't stand with their own values, that democracies and liberals are forgiving the legitimate pride of themselves, then of course they advance, they push. And the international of the illiberal push their advantage everywhere.
On that note, we have a clip from a documentary you recently released, Glory to the Heroes. If I understand correctly, a former IDF soldier joining the Ukrainians to fight against the Russians. And he has something very interesting to say. Let's take a listen to.
Qu'ont-ils transmis ces fils d'Israël à leurs compagnons ukrainiens?
A different way of thinking. You know, in the big countries, sometimes they don't think that small soldiers can do something. In Israel, it's different because you don't have a lot of people. All the fighting force of the regular Israeli army, it's about one division of Ukraine, some kind. But and every loss of the soldier, it's a big problem for Israel.
There are profound connections between Ukraine and Israel as two countries fighting on the front lines of democracy. I would actually add a third to that, Taiwan. There are three countries in the world right now threatened with annihilation: Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, under threat from Iran, Russia, China, respectively. To me, it's especially disturbing to hear you talk that these countries are not only fighting geopolitical fight against other countries, but the tyrannical ideas of the Iranian regime, the Russian regime, the Chinese regime seem to have an increasing grip on the Western imagination among people who are bored with liberty and the burdens that it imposes. I'm wondering how you see that connection between Ukraine, Israel, and perhaps Taiwan, South Korea, as someone who's reported on the ground. What insights have you come away with?
First of all, I believe, this is the core of my belief, in this natural alliance between Israel and Ukraine. But more important than what I feel, the Ukrainian soldiers have brotherly feelings toward Israel. You cannot know how many times during these 2 years, which I spent sometimes, often on front line in Ukraine, I heard our model is Stal. So many times, so many units of Ukrainian army.
Sahal, the IDF.
IDF is the model. And these two gentlemen who you see here, it's an important moment of one of my films. They are IDF volunteers fighting in Ukrainian army and sharing experience, sharing knowledge, and achieving great goals. I cannot say the details. So there is this community of destiny. There is this mutual admiration between the two. They are, Ukrainian army and the Israeli army, probably the best in the West because of solitude, because of training, because of having to face a real enemy and not a virtual enemy as, thanks God for the moment, NATO. So they're the best. And there is this link of life, and this film, Glory to the Heroes, part of it is devoted to stress this line of life between Ukraine and Israel. And you quoted Taiwan. You know, America and the West are terrified by a takeover of Taiwan by China. Legitimately, they're right, because it would be a disaster even for our way of life, computer, and you know, all of that. But I can predict you something today. If Israel does not win the war over Hamas, and if Ukraine does not recuperate her territory against Putin, you will have an invasion of Taiwan. I'm absolutely sure of that. If the West loses in Ukraine, if the West loses in Gaza and in front of Iran, Taiwan will fall.
I'm wondering if we circle back and think about the central concept of your book, Solitude of Israel. Whether the solution to this existential problem of solitude actually lies in the same reasons that we have that solitude in the first place. What do I mean? If I understand your analysis, you're saying part of the reason that Israel stands alone is the general ennui within Western society about freedom, about democracy, about liberty, about a nation state, about the values that Israel represents that were at one point the values of Europe that seem to have gone out of vogue. But actually Israel's great calling, Israel's fate, is to stand for those values, the values of a nation state, of sovereignty, of self-defense, of self-reliance, and that it's the connection between Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan and other democracies under threat from their neighbors that actually gives Israel its calling, that gives Israel its meaning, that gives Israel its contemporary relevance and salience in the world to continue speaking up and saying, this is why we are here, and this is why we are here, and this is why you should care about Israel and its survival and its prosperity, because we're on the front lines of democracy. It seems to be, on the one hand, Israel's Achilles heel, but also the solution for those who care about reclaiming those values.
And Israel has many natural allies in the world. Beyond what you say, there are a lot of suffering people, weak nations, threatened states, threatened by empires who recognize themselves in Israel, who are pray in secret or vocally for the victory of Israel. There are a lot, but generally they pray secretly because they are hostages of tyranny. But you have in Iran, you have in the Federation of Russia, you have in Asia, you have a lot of countries who think that the victory of Israel is essential for them. All those shaken people, victims people, they feel represented by the young democracy of Israel, for sure. But this has to, if I were an Israeli diplomat, if I were in another life, I would probably go all over the world to go and meet the natural allies of my country. They are more numerous than you think. You remember Durban 2001, Durban, South Africa, one Jew, one bullet. You remember that?
So this is talking about what was supposed to be the United Nations Conference Against Racism in 2001 that became this horrific explosion of anti-Jewish hate.
It was supposed to be a conference against racism, slavery, and so on. So many people came for that. They came to plead their case, to have a stage at last to plead their own case. How do you think they reacted when the Palestinians hijacked the conference? When the Islamists took the stage 100% to say one Jew, one bullet? They were awfully disappointed. All these people from India, all these people from Sri Lanka, all these minorities coming to express their suffering. And they really thought that the radical Islamists, especially Palestinians, stole the event. And they felt that day a natural feeling of alliance with Israel. And I remember I was just stepping out of a series of reports for Le Monde about these sorts of forgotten wars in Africa, in Sri Lanka. That's why I was just out of that. And I had so many messages during Durban, so many messages of big fighters, of brave women, of brave men who were crying, literally crying, by this hijacking of the cause of victimhood by the sole radical Palestinians. It was terrible for them, and they were the natural brothers of Israel. Maybe Israel should have had at that time diplomats who would take care of that. I don't know, but you have a reserve of allies among these. Bangladesh, for example, a country which I know very well, a great Muslim country, presided by a great Muslim lady, Sheikh Hasina. I'm sure that in Bangladesh, I know there is no anti-Israel feeling. It would not be very difficult to stress and to explain that there is a community of destiny, for example.
That's so intriguing to hear you say that, because when we look historically, anti-Semitism has always played the role of being a political call to action that would help to unify and mobilize societies where people would agree on nothing else, but they can agree on one thing, hate the Jews, scapegoat the Jews. Israel plays the same role in global institutions as being the one thing that all these countries can agree on. And of course, we in Israel suffer from that obsession, but there are other victims, the other causes that are forgotten and overlooked because of this mobilization against Israel, because of how much of the world's attention, the UN's resources are dedicated towards that. And it's fascinating that you think we have a way to climb out by building alliances with other minorities. Bernard-Henri Lévy, fascinating discussion about the solitude of Israel, how that Israel standing alone is not our fate. And I wonder, harking back to your analysis of that verse in Numbers saying, no, that is not a prophecy that Israel will stand alone, it's that Israel will stand tall as a special nation. A message of hope for Jewish listeners around the world now who are feeling isolated and alone and abandoned and betrayed. Your message about how things might get better.
All that we try to say today, if we are able to say it loudly, if we are able to say it with pride, will bring back hope, I think. And again, my message of hope is that we have natural allies. Just imagine what happens today in the head of a victim of the genocide in Darfur. for example. Imagine what is happening in the head of a Sudanese woman or man dying from hunger at this very minute. Imagine what happened to the forgotten 100,000 dead of the Syrian war, dead because of the butchery of Bashar al-Assad. Imagine what is in their head when they see all the world attention hijacked by the terrorist, fascist movement of Hamas. What do you think there is in their mind? They are not on that side. They curse the Hamas, and they pray for the victory of the right, of the law, of the peace embodied by Israel. I'm sure of that. Sudanese, Darfuri, Syrians, those who remember in Rwanda of the genocide which they suffered, they are numerous. The genocide is worshipped. The memory of genocide is worshipped. The memory of the victims, as it is as the Shoah, as the Holocaust in Israel. They are on the side of Israel. We have some allies. The weak people, the victimized, the real victimized people, they are on the side of Israel. We do it already, but we have more and more to extend our brotherly hand and hug to them. This might be the main source of hope.
So counterintuitive that in a world increasingly defined by the oppressor-oppressed narrative, you see the key to Israel's salvation as actually being forming an alliance among other oppressed people.
Of course.
Bernard-Henri Lévy, thank you very much for coming on State of a Nation and for coming to Israel to express so much solidarity with our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. We'll be back soon with more fascinating discussions about the state of our nation. I'm Ails Lévy, and thank you for joining us.